Hi, welcome to Sociological Lens. I am Dr. Dilsora Fozilova. In today's class, we will be talking about globalization and social change. So, what is globalization and what it has to do with social change? Globalization is the process of increasing interconnectedness and interdependence among countries, economies, cultures, and societies. It involves the movement of goods, services, capital, people, information, and ideas across borders, um, facilitated by advancements in technology, communication, and transportation. Globalization can be all in different forms. For example, it has economic, political, cultural, and social dimensions. Well, I'll be talking about this in the next slide in a deeper sense. Economically, it leads to global trade, multinational corporations, and financial integration. Politically, it influences governance, international organizations, and global policies. Culturally, it promotes the exchange of traditions, languages, and media, but it can also lead to cultural homogenization. Socially, globalization affects migration, labor markets, and social structures. While globalization has benefits like economic growth, innovation, and cultural exchange, also can downsides. Um, it also has downsides such as job displacement, income inequality, and environmental degradation. Sociologists often examine its impact on social stratification, identity, and power dynamics. Let's talk about different forms of globalization. So, globalization is a complex, multi-dimensional process that affects various aspects of society, such as economic, political, cultural, and others. So, the first one I want to talk about is economic globalization. Economic globalization refers to the increasing interdependence of global economies through trade, investment, and financial markets. For example, it characterized by international trade, free trade agreements like NAFTA, WTO, encourage the movements of goods and services across borders. Multinational corporations, we call them MNCs. Companies like Apple, McDonald's, and Amazon operate in multiple countries, creating global supply chains. Foreign direct investments, we call them FDI. Countries invest in businesses and industries across the world, leading to economic integration. And also labor market integration. That is outsourcing and offshoring lead to job shifts across regions, affecting employment opportunities. And there are various pros and cons of this economic globalization. Some of the pros can be like economic growth, innovation, lower prices, increased efficiency. Some of the cons can be job displacement, exploitation of workers, widening income inequality, and so on. The second one is political globalization. Political globalization refers to the increasing influence of international institutions, global governance, and diplomatic relations. For example, international organizations like United Nations, World Trade Organization, and International Monetary Fund, they shape policies and regulations in the world. And the other one can be supranational governance, that is, regional bodies like European Union create shared laws and policies beyond national borders. Also, global cooperation. Countries work together on issues such as climate change, security, and human rights. The another one I want to talk about is the sovereignty concerns. Some argue that globalization reduced national control over policies and economies, which leads to the weaker sovereignty and more like sovereignty concerns. So some of the pros can be peaceful diplomacy, coordinated efforts on global issues. Some of the cons can be loss of national sovereignty, political dependency on global institutions. The third one is cultural globalization. Cultural globalization refers to the spread of ideas, values, traditions, and lifestyles across the world. The media entertainment, for example, Hollywood films, K-pop, Netflix, and social media create a shared global culture. So you can see this stuff everywhere. Like Hollywood is everywhere, and K-pop, Netflix. You watch movies from all across the world on your Netflix. That is just kind of globalization of media and entertainment. Also, the spread of language can be another example for cultural globalization. English, for example, has become a dominant global language for businesses and communication. Everywhere people are learning English, speaking English, it's becoming one of the world languages. So that is cultural globalization. Consumer culture, brands like Nike, Starbucks, and Coca-Cola shape global consumer behavior. Recently, I went to Tashkent and I could see McDonald's there and some of the Western the fashion stores or department stores. I was like, the world became like one piece, right? So that is also an example of cultural globalization. Cultural hybridization is that local cultures adapt and mix with global influences. For example, McDonald's serving different menu items in different countries based on their preferences or probably like a locally available the raw materials like food and bread, whatever they use for their food. So pros of the cultural globalization is cultural exchange, diversity, awareness of global issues, and cons can be cultural homogenization, loss of indigenous cultures, dominance of Western values. There is like um, what it called the imperialism that one culture or one language is taking over the world while some smaller one is getting disappeared. So that is one of the cons of cultural globalization. So technological globalization refers to the rapid spread of technology and innovation worldwide. For example, digital communication, the internet, smartphones, and social media enables instant global connections. Also, artificial intelligence in automation. AI and robotics transform industries and labor markets around the world. Also, e-commerce and digital economy. Companies like Amazon and Alibaba facilitate global online trades. There is also cybersecurity and data privacy. That's part of technological globalization. Global networks raise concerns about digital security and surveillance all the time recently. Some of the good thing is about what technological globalization is faster innovation, access to knowledge worldwide, improved healthcare system, improved other cares. Like, for example, I can teach to the university in Uzbekistan while I'm in Canada. This is also technological globalization. Some of the cons of technological globalization can be digital divide, privacy issues, loss of jobs due to automation. Environmental globalization is next. Environmental globalization refers to the worldwide impact of human activities on the planet. Climate change, for example, can be an example for environmental globalization. Global industrialization leads to raising carbon emissions and global warming. Deforestation and biodiversity loss, expansion of agriculture and urbanization threatens ecosystems, therefore, it causes biodiversity loss. Global environmental agreements like treaties, like the Paris Agreement, aim to reduce global environmental damage. Also, there is pollution and waste management. Plastic waste, industrial pollution, and e waste create transnational environmental issues. Some of the pros of environmental globalization can be global cooperation on sustainability, renewable energy advancements, although there is still blockages on the way of working on global environmental issues. Some of the countries don't want to cut their economy to help the environment. However, there are some global cooperations on sustainability. Some of the cons of global environmental globalization can be environmental degradation, loss of biodiversity, and resource exploitation. Social globalization refers to the increasing movement of people and social interactions across borders, migration and creation of diasporas. People move for work, education, or safety, leading to multicultural societies. Global health challenges, for example, pandemics like COVID-19 highlight the need for global healthcare coordination, because some of the stuff like the viruses or infections don't know borders. They don't recognize borders. It just can spread around the world so fast. So therefore, we need some global healthcare coordination. Education and knowledge sharing. Universities collaborate globally, and online learning expands access to education. As I mentioned earlier, I do teach overseas, and that is allowed by this social globalization and technological globalization. Human rights movements, global activism on issues like gender equality, racial justice, and LGBTQ plus rights. This are becoming global activism because of social globalization. Some of the pros of global social globalization can be cultural exchange, better healthcare cooperation, improved human rights, and cons can be brain drain, migration of skilled workers, social tensions, cultural clashes, some of the cons of social globalization. And also, we can talk about legal globalization. What is legal globalization? Legal globalization refers to the development of international legal frameworks and regulations. For example, international law is part of legal globalization. The International Criminal Court, ICC, prosecutes crimes against humanity around the world. So that's very important legal globalization. Trade agreements in intellectual property, while all these companies going out their countries and working in different places, we have to have some global legal services like trade agreements and intellectual properties. Human rights protections, when people are moving around the world, they need their human rights. Therefore, universal laws against genocide, child labor, and discrimination is very important. Corporate regulations, global business standards address corruption, fair labor practices, and environmental responsibility. Some of the pros of legal globalization can be legal protection across borders, global human rights enforcement, while some of the cons can be legal conflicts between national and international laws, enforcement challenges. So, globalization is a powerful force shaping economies, politics, culture, technology, the environment, societies, and legal systems. While it fosters connectivity, innovation, and cooperation, it also raises concerns about inequality, environmental damage, cultural homogenization, and political dependency. The challenge lies in managing globalization in a way that balances benefits and risks while promoting equity and sustainability. So let's take a look at some of the different waves of globalization. So pre-modern globalization, we think of that up to the 15th century. Globalization is often seen as a modern phenomena, but its roots stretch back thousands of years. Before the 15th century, early trade networks and cultural exchanges laid the foundation for the interconnected world. While these processes were slower and more regional than modern globalization, they still facilitated the movement of goods, ideas, religions, and technologies across vast distances. So the early trade networks and economic globalization started with the Silk Road in 130 BC to 1450s CE. So one of the most famous pre-modern trade routes, the Silk Road, connected China, Central Asia, and Middle East and Europe. It facilitated the exchange of silk, spices, precious metals, glass, and textiles. Merchants, travelers, and diplomats spread goods as well as ideas, religions, and technologies. So it boosted economies across regions, integrating markets from China to Mediterranean. It led to cultural diffusion and the blending of traditions. It helped spread innovations such as paper making, printing, and gunpowder from China to Europe. Also, there was another, the Indian Ocean trade that was 200 BCE to 105, 1500 CE, connected East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, India, Southeast Asia, and China. Goods spread, goods traded includes spices, pepper, cinnamon, textiles, ivory, gold, and porcelain. The monsoon winds allowed merchants to travel long distances seasonally. Islamic merchants played a dominant role in organizing trade and finances at that time. It had a huge impact in the world. It encouraged economic integration between Africa, Middle East, and Asia, spread of Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism through merchant communities. It increased demand for luxury goods in Europe and Asia. Another one is the Trans-Sahara trade, that's 8th century to 16th century. It connected West Africa and North Africa and the Mediterranean world. Gold, salt, and enslaved people were key trade goods in this, the Trans-Sahara trade. There was camel caravans were essential for crossing the harsh Sahara desert. The rise of powerful West African empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai was linked to this trade. It also had a great impact in the world. It led to the spread of Islam to West Africa, stimulated urbanization and wealth in African cities like Timbuktu and Gao. It facilitated the exchange of knowledge with Islamic scholars establishing centers of learning. So the another one can be cultural and religious exchanges. So the cultural and religious exchanges, it was the spread of major religions. Religions played a significant role in pre-modern globalization by uniting people across vast regions. For example, Buddhism spread from India to China, Korea, and Japan via the Silk Road and maritime routes. Islam expanded from Arabian Peninsula across North Africa, Central Asia, India, and Southeast Africa through trade and conquest. Christianity spread from Roman Empire to Europe, Ethiopia, and parts of Asia. So this also impacted the world enormously, creating common cultural and ethical frameworks in different regions, encouraging literacy and scholarship as religious institutions became centers of learning, promoted artistic and architectural developments like mosques and churches and stupas and other things. So there was also technological and knowledge transfers. The Chinese invention of paper making spread to the Islamic world and then to Europe. The compass and advanced shipbuilding techniques spread from China. Revolutionized navigation. Also, mathematical concepts such as algebra were transferred from Islamic world to Europe. The interesting thing about this is a lot of sciences, math, and medicine, and other things was formulated or developed in Islamic countries and then spread to Europe. And then now you can see that some Western countries in Europe becoming the prominent places or main places for science and art and other things later on. Also, medical knowledge from Persia and India influenced European and Middle Eastern medicine. So this allowed the growth of science, philosophy, and exploration, laid the groundwork for later developments in the Renaissance and Age of Exploration. Political and military globalization, as we mentioned earlier, the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th century. At its height, the Mongol Empire stretched from China to Eastern Europe. It unified large territories, creating a stable trade environment across Eurasia. The Mongols promoted religious tolerance and supported scholars, artists, and engineers. They improved the portal and communication systems, making travel and trade much safer than before. It facilitated the movement of merchants like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, who recorded their observations of global trade. It spread technologies and crops between Asia, Middle East, and Europe, increased interconnections between different civilizations, preparing the world for later globalization. Also, there was crusades, 15th, 13th, the 11th and 13th centuries. There was religious wars between Christian Europe and Islamic world over control of Holy Land, created contact between European and Middle Eastern cultures, leading to the transfer of knowledge. Europeans were imposed to advance Islamic science, medicine, and architecture. It stimulated trade between Europe and Middle East. It introduced European merchants to spices, textile, and luxury goods from Asia. It also helped spark the Renaissance by reviving classical knowledge. So also, last thing I want to talk is environmental and biological globalization. I want to give some examples to that. For example, spread of crops and agriculture like rice, sugar, citrus fruits spread from Islamic world to Europe. Cotton and spices moved between India and the Mediterranean. New irrigation techniques improved agricultural outputs, so it led to the population growth and urbanization, also created interdependence between regions for food productions. Um, One of the downside of this was the spread of diseases, the Black Death, the bubonic plague, Black Death spread via Silk Road and Indian Ocean trade routes in the 14th century. So COVID-19 is not the first one that traveled all across the world. That Black Death killed actually 30 to 60% of Europe's population and affected Asia and Middle East. It caused economic and social disruptions, weakening feudal systems in Europe. Also, it led to labor shortages and increased wages for peasants, shifted economic power from feudal lords to emerging urban centers. So, in conclusion, that pre-modern globalization was marked by early trade networks, cultural exchanges, and technological transfers. While slower than modern globalization, it connected distant civilizations through commerce, religion, and exploration. The Silk Road, Indian Ocean trade, and Mongol Empire played crucial roles in shaping more interconnected world, setting the stage for the age of exploration in the 15th century onwards. Um, so now I want to talk about what the stages of globalization. Oh, the capitalism. Oh my goodness. Stages of capitalism, because now the stages of capitalism, the next part of globalization. Capitalism and globalization are deeply interconnected. As capitalism has evolved, it has driven and been shaped by global trade, finance, and production systems. Some of the stages I would like to talk about is that mercantile capitalism in the 15th to 18th century. What you can see in your screen here is the colonial, post-colonial, and then welfare and global. But I will give you a little bit more idea about the different stages of capitalism. Based on the merchant capitalism in 15th, 18th centuries were based on state-controlled trade and colonial expansion. The accumulation of wealth through gold, silver, and resource extraction was very important or significant in that time. It led to the expansion of global trade routes like Atlantic slave trade, East India companies, and the heavy government involvement in regulating trade through tariffs, monopolies, and navigation laws were very important. the role of globalization in this was incredible. It led to European colonialism in the Americas, Africas, and Asia. It led to it created global commodity chains like sugar, tobacco, spices, and slaves. It spread European influence, languages, and cultures worldwide. And it also encouraged early financial institutions like stock exchanges, joint stock companies, and other things. So you can see that globalization in the early stages of capitalism was similar to what we're observing in our time, that what was happening was very similar. The example can be the British and Dutch East India companies established early multinational trade networks. Then what happened is industrial capitalism in 18th, 19th centuries. The key features of industrial capitalism was the transition from handcraft-based production to machine-based manufacturing. People weren't doing the shoe by their hands anymore. There wasn't a shoemaker's family. Now they had big manufacturing companies creating thousands of shoes in one day. A growth of factories, mechanization and urbanization, expansion of wage labor, and the decline of feudal economies. In our last classes, I talked to you about slavery and moving from slavery to wage labor because slavery became less profitable. And then people moved towards wage labor because the merchants now didn't want to be responsible for those sick slaves or taking care of them when they got old and all those kind of headaches. Now that the intention for creating bigger profit led expansion of wage labor. Also, laissez-faire economies, minimal government interference, free markets also was a key features of industrial capitalism. And the role of globalization in this was very important. It increased demand for raw materials, cotton, rubber, oil, led to deeper imperialist expansion. Railroads, steamships, and telegraphs improved global connectivity. Migration of laborers and settlers to industrial hubs, indentured labor from India to the Caribbean, expansion of global financial markets and banking systems. For example, the Industrial Revolution fueled British and European expansion into Africa and Asia to secure resources and markets through colonialism. So also I mentioned in our last classes, there was three main things that colonialism was intending to have. One of them was securing cheap labor, resources, and markets. Like one of them was cheap labor. Second one is resources, and that third one is the markets. So the next one is monopoly, imperialist capitalism in the late 19th and 20th centuries. The key features of monopoly in imperialist capitalism was rise of corporate monopolies and trusts like Standard Oil or Carnegie Steel, and further colonialization for raw materials and markets. It shifted from free markets to state supported industries and protectionism, and also emergence of capital rivalries leading to conflicts like World War One and then later World War Two. A role of globalization in this process was also very important. It accelerated accelerated global trade competition and economic nationalism. Colonial labor systems expanded to fuel industrial economies. Financial crises and depressions affected global markets. Also, military industrial expansion and arms trade fueled geopolitical conflicts in its time. The example can be that scramble for Africa, 1880s and 1914s, so European powers dividing Africa to control resources for industrial economies. And then in the mid 20th century to 1970s, we will call it like a Fordist Keynesian capitalism. The key features of that was mass production and mass consumption, assembly line production, automotives and automobiles, and then there was a welfare state policies that minimum wages, labor protection, and social security spread around the world. And there was a high economic growth, particularly in the West and Japan. The rise of multinational corporations and global trade agreements was very important part of that. And the role of globalization in this was, of course, obvious, that expansion of American economic influence, like Marshall Plan, Bretton Woods system. Also, the World Bank, IMF, established the stabilized global economies, growth of consumer culture worldwide, like Coca-Cola and Hollywood was all over the world. Decolonization started at that time. It led to new global economic alliances like non-aligned movements. For example, post World War II, global reconstruction saw US influence expand through economic aid and multinational corporations. So then I will be talking about neoliberal globalized capitalism after 1980s in my next video. The key features of that was deregulation, privatization, and free trade policies, shift from industrial economies to service and finance economies. There was a rise of global supply chains and outsourcing, like manufacturing moving to developing countries, for example, from US to Mexico and China and other places. Financialization was stock markets, hedge funds, and cryptocurrencies, and growth of digital capitalism like big tech, e-commerce, AI-driven economies. They are the neoliberal global capitalism. So role of globalization, of course, in this is immense. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of global free market systems, trade liberalization like NAFTA, WTO, EU, integrated world markets, rise of China as a global manufacturing hub, also the global labor mobility leading to migration and outsourcing, and the environmental consequences due to mass production of consumptions. The example can be 1990s technological boom and financial globalization led to the rise of Silicon Valley and internet-based economies like Google and Amazon. So what's the future of capitalism? The growing inequality in climate crisis have led to calls for post-capital systems, the rise of green capitalism, carbon trading, circular economies, emergence of AI-driven economies, and automation challenges for labor. There's all different kinds of future concerns when it comes to capitalism and globalization. Some scholars predict that shift towards mixed economies, cooperative ownership, or degrowth models to address capitalism's limitations, probably best ways to address them. So each stage of capitalism transforms and expands globalization, and in turn, globalization accelerates changes in capitalism. From mercantile empires to digital capitalism, capitalism has been the driving force behind international trade, labor mobility, and cultural exchanges. However, its challenges, such as inequality, climate change, and financial instability, continues to shape debates about its future. So now, colonialism was the first major stage of capitalist expansion, and I want to talk a little bit about that because that is very important for our upcoming midterm exam. Colonialism was the first major stage of global capitalist expansion, beginning in the 15th century with European exploration and lasting until the mid 20th century. It was primarily driven by economic, political, and military domination of the nation over other territory and its people. So this expansion allowed European powers to extract resources, labor, and wealth, which fueled the growth of capitalism and global trade networks. So the economic domination, capitalism's expansion through resource extraction and trade was very important. It was economically driven. The search for wealth and resources was the main force behind colonialism. European powers sought gold and silver and spices, cotton, sugar, and other valuable resources to accumulate wealth. Colonies were exploited as sources of raw materials and captive markets for finished goods. The extraction of resources was often forced through slavery, coercion, and land dispositions. And there was a rise of mercantilism, 1500s and 1700s. Mercantilism was the dominant economic policy. Colonies could only trade with their European rulers, like British colonies could only sell raw materials to Britain. High tariffs and monopolies protected the mother country's industries. Joint stock companies like British East India Company, Dutch East India Company managed colonial trade, acting as early multinational corporations. We talked about the triangular trade system between Africa, Europe, and Americas. It involved slaves from Africa forced to work on plantations in the Americas, raw materials like sugar, cotton, tobacco shipped to Europe for processing, and manufactured goods like textile, guns, alcohol sold in Africa, fueling further exploitation. So this is the triangular trade between Africa, Europe, and Americas. Industrial capitalism and the expansion of colonial markets in 18th centuries and 19th centuries was one of the biggest expansions of colonial markets. The Industrial Revolution created a greater need for cheap raw materials and new markets. Colonial railroads, mines, and plantations were developed to serve European industries. Some colonized economies were structured to benefit the colonizers, as preventing local industrial development. And we can see this colonialism, which was the expansion of capitalism, gave rise to slavery as an institution of racism, as an ideology and practices. European conquest and the justification of colonial rule was possible through wild justifications for colonial rules, including the civilizing mission. The Europeans had to come to Americas and other places and civilize people because they were portrayed uncivilized and in need of European governance. Like, for example, indigenous people in Canada were portrayed as uncivilized. Religious conversion, that they thought that Christian missionaries often supported colonial expansion. They thought that Christianity is very important to spread around the world, and also scientific racism. Pseudo-scientific theories claimed Europeans were biologically superior, therefore the world were their playground, so they could just go and do whatever they wanted to. So also the colonial administrative systems, that colonial governance took different forms. Direct rule, like French colonies in Africa, colonizers imposed their government laws and institutions. We will talk about this in the different expansions of colonialism. And the indirect rule, that was local elites were used to administer colonial policies. Also, settler colonies like Canada, Australia, South Africa, European settlers displaced indigenous populations and took control of land and resources. There was exploitation of labor, as we are talking about the rise of slavery. Colonized people were often forced into plantation labor, mining, and infrastructure projects. Land was seized from indigenous peoples and turned into cash crop plantations. And also, taxation systems forced local populations into wage labor to pay colonial taxes. The military domination, I think I had some of those. Military domination was about violence, repression, and resistance. Colonial expansion was backed by military invasions, superior weaponry, and strategic alliances. European armies had technological advancement or advantages over indigenous people. They had guns, steel, naval power, and over local resistance. Colonizers built fortresses, naval bases, and military outposts to maintain control in colonized land. For example, the British Opium Wars in 1839, 1842, also 1856, 1860s, forced China to open its markets to British trade, including opium, which devastated Chinese society. Repression and resistance movements also started. Colonized people resisted through revolts, guerrilla warfare, and uprisings. European powers often responded with brutal crackdowns, massacres, and imprisonment. Anti-colonial intellectuals and revolutionaries emerged, changing European rule. So some of those resistance can be that, example can be the Hayatan Revolution in 1791 to 1804, enslaved African, overthrew French rule, establishing the first independent Black republic in Haiti, and also the Indian rebellion in 1857, a major uprising against British rule, leading to the formal takeover of India by British Crown. And there was also Mau Mau rebellion in 1952 to 1960s, Kenyan resistance against British rule met with violent suppression. So people were uniting to resist colonial powers now and overthrowing them from their land and changing the systems. However, the legacy of colonialism and capitalist globalization is immense. There is neo-colonial and global inequality in the world we talk about. Even after formal colonial rule ended, decolonization in the mid-20th century, economic and political dependency remained. Neocolonialism refers to how formal colonial powers continue to exploit developing nations through trade, debt, and multinational national corporations. For example, many African nations remain dependent on Western banks and corporations for loans and trade, often on unfair terms. And also the global south and versus global north, like polarization emerged. The global north continues to dominate trade, finance, and technology, while global south, developing nations, struggles with poverty, debt, and political instability. The structure set up during colonialism, export-oriented economies, reliance on foreign investments, still shape global economic relations around the world. The one example can be the World Bank and IMF often impose austerity measures on developing nations, limiting their ability to invest in social programs and industrialization. So to conclude this, the colonialism, it is economic, political, and military domination. The colonialism was the first major stage of capital's expansion. This is the part you have to remember, creating a global economy based on resource extraction, political domination, and military control. It fueled industrial capitalism by providing cheap labor, raw materials, and capital markets. Even after decolonization, it affected persist through economic dependency, corporate exploitation, and global inequalities. So, global expansion and globalization of primitive accumulation. This is very important. Primitive accumulation refers to the historical process through which capitalism emerged by dispossessing people of their land, resources, and means of production, forcing them into wage labor. Karl Marx introduced the concept of capital, Volume 1, describing how early capitalist economies accumulated wealth through violence, exclusion, slavery, and colonial plunder. Globalization has extended and reshaped this process, spreading capitalist accumulation across the world through imperialism, colonialism, and modern neoliberalism. So, what is primitive accumulation? Just let's get into that and understand it better. Marx argued that capitalism did not emerge naturally, but was born dripping from head to toe, from every pore with blood and dirt. That is, I'm quoting from Marx. So he says that born dripping from head to toe, from every pore with blood and dirt. It involved expropriation of land, that is enclosure movement in Europe. We can talk about it is also destruction of communal economies, that subsistence farming replaced by market dependency. Also forced labor systems like slavery, serfdom, indentured labor. Also, it is about plunder of colonies, that gold, silver, spices, and raw materials extracted from global south. And this process created a landless working class dependent on wages and enabled capitals to accumulate massive wealth. In 16th century England, the Enclosure Act, for example, pushed peasants off communal land, forcing them into wage labor in cities and factories. The global primitive accumulation, just think about colonial expansion and capital's foundations. As European powers expanded globally, primitive accumulation was not just a European phenomena, but a global process. The colonization of Americas, Africa, and Asia provided the material foundation for capitalism's expansion. Land disposition and resource extraction was the number one causes of globalizing primitive accumulation. Indigenous lands were seized and privatized, disrupting traditional ways of life. Colonies, for example, the British and Dutch colonies, were forced into cash crop economies, sugar, cotton, coffee, tobacco, integrating them into capital systems. Atlantic slave trade, as we mentioned earlier, and forced labor. Primitive accumulation relies heavily on slavery and forced labor, which creates surplus wealth for capital's expansion. Enslaved Africans produced goods like cotton and sugar for European markets, accelerating industrial growth. For example, the profits from Caribbean plantations financed the British industrial revolution, creating capital's banking institutions. The colonial powers imposed taxation and market dependency, destroying subsistence economies. Land industries were undermined by European manufacturing goods, which we call it destruction of non-capitalist economies. For example, the British deindustrialized India by banning Indian textile exports and forcing it to buy British-made textiles, collapsing the indigenous economy through just this process. Also, neoliberalism we looked at neoliberalism as a new form of primitive accumulation in our time, which I'll be talking about this in my next video. In the 20th century and 21st centuries, primitive accumulation did not stop, but transformed through globalization in neoliberal policies. If I give you a little bit hint for next video, that was about privatization and land grabs. Global financial institutions like IMF and World Bank forced nations to privatize public resources, turning land, water, and healthcare into commodities. Land grabbing, on the other hand, by multinational corporations displaced indigenous communities. For example, The Green Revolution in Africa and Asia replaced subsistence farming with agribusiness and controlled GMO crops, creating dependency on corporations like Monsanto. Um, Also, debt and structural adjustment programs, which we call them SAPs, developing nations forced into debt dependency must comply with IMF and World Bank reforms that cut social programs and deregulate markets. And cheap labor markets like sweatshops and other things emerge, echoing earlier forms of forced labor, like it was another forms of slavery and forced labor. Digital and financial primitive accumulation can be seen in global corporations extract data, intellectual property, and digital labor as new forms of primitive accumulation. The rise of gig economies and precarious work mirrors historical proletariat, the proletariat organizations, right? Big tech platforms like Amazon and Uber exploit workers by avoiding labor protection, suppressing wages, and monopolizing markets. Also, some of the examples of primitive accumulation in the 21st century can be that from land closures to corporate land grabs, from slavery to workshops and precarious labor, from colonial plunder to debt-driven extraction, from raw materials exploitation to digital and data colonialism. So those are our time primitive accumulation. So to conclude this, the globalization of primitive accumulation shows how capitalism continually reinvents exploitation and sustain itself. While traditional colonial plunder has ended, the mechanisms of disposition, privatization, forced labor, financial domination remain central to the capitalism today. So another thing I would like to talk in this lecture is extensive and intensive capital's expansion. This is in your exam also. Capital's expansion occurs in two primary ways, that extensive and intensive. This forms of expansion describes how capitalism grows either by spreading into new territories and markets or by deepening its influence within existing economies and societies. Both processes have historically shaped globalization and continue to drive economic transformation today. Let's talk about extensive capital's expansion, the geographic spread of capitalism. Extensive expansion refers to the outward spread of capital's economic systems into new regions, territories, and populations that were previously outside of capital's production of exchange. So, spatial expansion, capitalism incorporates new lands, markets, and labor forces into its system. European powers expanded capitalism globally through colonial conquest, resource extraction, and trade networks. Also, feudal subsistence or indigenous economies were forcibly integrated into global markets. Expansion often involves introducing new goods, financial systems, and wage labor. Some of the examples can be European colonialism in the 15th, 19th century, as we mentioned earlier. The Americas, Africa, and Asia were brought into global capitalist trade through plantations, mining, and cash crop economies. And another example can be the scramble for Africa, 1880s and 1914. As I mentioned also, European powers carved up Africa to extract rubber, gold, diamonds, and other raw materials, integrating local economies into global capitalism. China's Belt and Road Initiative in the 21st century can be another example, expanding capital's infrastructure into Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So effects of extensive expansion can be increases global trade and resource access, creates new markets and labor forces. Bad things about this extensive territorial expansion is it destroys traditional economies, it leads to imperialism, forced labor, and environmental destruction. The second one is intensive capital's expansion, the deepening of capital's relations. The intensive expansion refers to the intensification of capital's production, consumption, and labor exploitation within already capitalist economies. Instead of expanding geographically, capitalism penetrates deeper into daily life, social institutions, and even human behavior. Increased commodification, for example, turning more aspects of life like healthcare, education, even emotions into profit-driven industries. Technological innovations can be another key character of intensive capital's expansion. More automation, productivity, and efficiency, increasing profits without expanding territory. Shifting from industrial production to financial speculation, where banks, loans, and investments drive profits. Also, surveillance capitalism. We will be talking about this in our next classes. Companies extract data from users, Google, Facebook, and turn personal information into commodities. Gig and precarious labor, moving away from stable employment to contract work, platforms, for example, Uber, Amazon, and informal economies. This all examples or character of intensive capital's expansion. One of the things I would like to say this is in extensive territorial expansion, perhaps we can undo it, but intensive or new social spheres is just deeply ingrained into societies, and it's next to impossible to undo this kind of expansion. Some of the examples of intensive expansion can be industrial revolution, steam engines and factory systems increasing productivity without expanding geography in the 19th century, Fordism and Taylorism in the 20th century, mass production of efficiency techniques, transformed labor, making work more mechanized and repetitive. That, you know, and then neoliberalism is another example in the 1980s to present. Privatization, deregulation, austerity, financial capitalism have deepened capitalist control over everyday life. Big techs, 21st century companies like Amazon and Google commodify human behavior, personal data, and digital labor. Some of the positive effects of extensive expansion can be increases efficiency and productivity. It creates new industries and services. Some of the warning effects of extensive expansion can be increases worker exploitation and job insecurity, expands capitals into personal life and capitalism into personal life and social relations. So how extensive and intensive expansion are interconnected? So this too is Both of them are very connected and often occur together, reinforcing each other. Colonialism, that extensive one, Industrial Revolution, European expansion provided raw materials, cotton, rubber, which fueled mechanized factory production, while extensive digital capitalism, as multinational corporations expand into new regions, they also deepen capitalist exploitation through automation, surveillance, and financialization. So, to conclude this all, extensive expansion spread capitalism into new areas, markets, and labor pools. Intensive expansion deepened capitalism's control over production, labor, and daily life. Both processes drive globalization, inequality, and new forms of exploitation, making capitalism a constantly evolving system. One more thing before we finish this. Yes. One more slide. Waves of globalization. I shouldn't have said first wave, but waves of globalization. Globalization has developed in waves, each shaped by technological advancements, economic systems, and political changes. These waves represent different periods of increased global interconnectedness through trade, migration, communication, and cultural exchange. So, to understand the waves of globalization, historians and economists often categorize globalization into four stages, four major stages, I would say, or waves, each driven by specific transformation in trade, production, and migration. Number one is pre-modern globalization. That is 15th century, pre-15th century, early trade networks like Silk Road, Indian Ocean trade, migration, and cultural exchanges. We already talked about that. Early modern globalization, 15th to 18th century. That is European exploration, colonial expansion, mercantilism, and Atlantic slave trades. And then industrial globalization, 19th to 20th century, industrial revolution, free trade, mass migration, imperialism, and technological processes. And the last one is contemporary globalization, 20th century to present day, digital revolution, multinational corporations, global finance, and neoliberal policies. So, how industrial revolution shaped globalization. The Industrial Revolution was a turning point in globalization, driving massive increases in production, trade, and migration. There was mass production of the factories, and mechanization led to increased demand for raw materials from colonies. New markets were created as industrialized nations sought to sell manufactured goods worldwide. The rise of steamships and railroads accelerated the speed and scale of global trades. And then imperialism as an economic expansion in overseas scramble for Africa, British rule in India to control resources, labor, and trade routes. The gold standard and banking systems made global trade more interconnected, and also global migration and labor movements. Industrialization created new job opportunities, replaced slavery with waged labor, with workers from China, India, and Africa moving to plantations and railroads, urbanization. So this is the whole different waves of globalization. Migration and global labor movements, very important. We talk about push and pull factors of migration: poverty, land disposition, industrial job losses, wars, famine. And pull factors can be economic opportunities, industrial jobs, political stability. Colonial and post-colonial migrations happen. Contemporary globalization happened through new technologies and digital trade, neoliberal policies in 1980s to present deregulation, privatization, and free markets, accelerated globalization. So to conclude all of this, waves of globalization and capital's expansion happened from early pre-modern world, pre-15th century, and continued until today. Each wave of globalization intensified global trade, migration, and economic integration. The Industrial Revolution transformed production, labor, and global economies and structures. And today's globalization built on past waves with digital capitalism, reshaping trade and migration patterns. So I'll just end today's first video here. That is in the first part of globalization. And in the next part of your lecture, I'll be talking about neoliberalism and globalism in our world. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in our next video. Bye.